So yeah, so today, like I say, I'm going to talk about hashtag rights and not charity. So this is basically the strapline of and the hashtag of a new alliance that has been emerging for the last couple of years from my work around food insecurity, which I'm going to tell you all about today. And as well, hopefully there'll be some of you who are interested in getting involved and find out a bit more as well. So just a quick overview about what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start off giving a bit of a context to the growth and reach of food banks in the UK, but really situating that in a COVID-19 context. And then also I'm going to bring in some arguments around this idea of fragmentations of poverty and why that matters, because I think all of these things are really interlinked and are important for when we're thinking about the growth of food banks and food insecurity. Then I'm going to talk a bit about my own ethnographic work on food banks, which I began in 2013. And then, sort of, like I say, tell a story of how that's developed. And then I'll finish off by introducing you to work I've been doing with colleagues in the US and Canada and the UK around our Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health and Social Justice. So I'll introduce you to the work we've been doing since 2018, some of the aims on that, and then I'll end by sort of encouraging you all to get involved with that if you're interested. All right, so I was just saying this to Julie and Sandria before we started, but I think as I was looking across the programme for today and all of the great talks that are going to be happening across the next couple of days, it was clear, hopefully, that what I'm going to be talking about today is going to really align well and set us all up for a really fantastic couple of days. I was just looking at the questions that were sort of being posed as part of the conference and sort of to get us thinking. And I think really all of these are relevant for the talk that I'm going to be giving today. I think especially when we're thinking about, you know, how we can reimagine food systems going forward and in hopefully a post-COVID context. I think particularly thinking about health and health inequalities, social justice, sustainability, and what can we do to achieve that? Who should we be working with? Who should we be having conversations with? I think particularly how we link change at a bigger macro level with everyday practices, and especially in my work, particularly at the moment, a lot of my work really does involve working with people at grassroots level, activists, people with lived experience. And finally as well, and something that I think won't be getting away from for a long time, but thinking about how COVID-19's impacted upon food and food systems more broadly. So I think all of those questions that have been posed today, like I say, are really relevant for my talk today. So I think we all will be well aware by now that since the beginning of the pandemic in March last year, we've seen an absolutely massive rise around emergency food provision, not just in the UK, but more broadly. So we've seen how COVID has, you know, really exacerbated previously already high levels of people's poverty and food insecurity, but we've seen how the pandemic has really caused additional hardships for people who are living on a low income, and we've seen how basically food bank use has skyrocketed. And so we've seen how basically the pandemic has exposed injustices and inequalities in the global north in particular, and this is where we're situating our Global Solidarity Alliance work. You'll see we've got speech marks around global north because that's a term that you know, can be critiqued and pulled apart a bit. But I think we've seen particularly marginalised communities for people in so-called wealthy countries that, you know, food inequalities have really been, let's say, exacerbated by the pandemic. So in the UK, we've seen through independent food banks, I've seen, you know, huge, and that word unprecedented, which I think I'd love to put that word in the bin by now, I've heard it so much, but unprecedented increases in the need for emergency food parcels through 2020. So the Independent Food Aid Network, of which I've been a trustee for the past few years, the work that has been done mapping what's happening with independent food banks has shown that there's been a 190% rise in the number of 3-day emergency food parcels. And that was just through counting 83 independent food banks in the year between May 2020 to May 2021. So we know obviously the Trussell Trust, who release their figures every year. They've shown a record 2.5 million emergency food parcels distributed to people in crisis, which is a 33% increase over the previous year. But as I always say when I'm talking about food bank statistics in the UK, we do need to look at obviously the independent food banks in parallel with that, and also thinking about places that aren't part of those sort of official counts, you know, places such as schools, universities, hospitals, places like that where emergency food can be given out, and even thinking about sort of more smaller community levels where there might be sort of, you know, smaller, more local, you know, community-based efforts to distribute charitable food to people. So the actual picture is a lot bigger than the statistics tell us. So we know there's actually a lot more people who are experiencing food insecurity, who are accessing food banks, and the overall picture shows that the pandemic has, as we might expect, has exacerbated those issues. But it isn't something that we've just seen in the UK context. And just to say, I've got some links on these slides, so obviously I'll share the slides afterwards for anyone who wants to access them. What we've seen in the US, and there's a picture I think on the next slide, but this is basically mile-long queues that were taking place in the US. This was, I think, just ahead of Thanksgiving weekend last November, just showing up the people that were actually queuing up to access food banks and soup kitchens, food pantries and soup kitchens. And so we saw that in the US, the equivalent of 4.2 billion meals were given out between March and November last year. And 80% of food pantries and soup kitchens were supporting more people than they had before the pandemic. So again, really emphasising how COVID played a role in exacerbating all of these issues. I think in a Canadian context as well, we saw, you know, food banks struggling to stay open and meet rising demand, something again that we saw in the UK. And in all three countries, you know, there's been growing numbers of the newly hungry. Again, I've put that in those speech marks because I don't like that term really, but I think just, you know, emphasising that there were people who were coming to access charitable food often for the first time, you know, people who had been in perhaps previously, you know, perhaps more insecure jobs or in more secure positions, more secure financial positions, were finding themselves having to use food banks or food aid for the first time. And I think what we've seen amidst all of this is a sort of worrying rise of corporate involvement and direct funding from governments. You know, I've spoken and written before about the rising corporate involvement around charitable food in the UK, in particular thinking about the Trussell Trust and ASDA partnership, where there was initially £20 million donated from ASDA to Trussell Trust. And I've written about that. If you have a look at, I've written a couple of articles in The Guardian on that. But we've seen even more of that sort of corporate involvement, and there's been private philanthropy as well, sort of coming into this emergency food scene, I suppose. And so I think the ultimate point to sort of set us up for thinking a bit more about this today is that, you know, we've seen that, you know, while emergency charitable food might sort of feed people temporarily in the moment, you know, they don't overall address people's underlying problems, which is really what is sending them to the food bank is overall an ultimate lack of income. It's about poverty. And so, you know, what we're arguing as part of our alliance as well is, you know, we can't just food bank our way out of persistent food insecurity. Food banks aren't going to solve the problem. They may provide a sort of really temporary sticking plaster. They sometimes might not as well, but really it's about looking at what is the underlying cause, and basically that is a lack of income and poverty. So I think tied into that, I just want to briefly sort of take you through this idea of fragmentations of poverty. So this is some work that I've been doing with Steve Crossley at Durham and Ruth Patrick at York for the last, I think it's about the last 3 years now. But basically our conversations and work around this started off when we set up a group chat on Twitter, and we would share with each other like different types of poverty types that were being discussed in the media. So you'll see, you know, there's clothing poverty. More recently, we've had laptop poverty, data poverty, coronavirus poverty, furniture poverty, pet poverty, all of these different types of poverties that have sort of arisen in possibly the last, I think, 5, if not 5 to 10 years. And we were concerned that, we keep having these additional sort of different types and fragmentations of poverty, but is that actually distracting from the wider overall picture of poverty in general? So, with these fragmentations of poverty, so think about, for instance, food poverty, often the sort of solutions that are offered to that are providing charitable food. With period poverty, it's about providing sanitary towels or sanitary products. So instead of actually, addressing perhaps the root causes, that there is a danger that those go sort of left untreated. And obviously that's, not at all to diminish the amazing work that a lot of, charities and organizations are doing, trying to do both, trying to tackle the root causes, but also trying to provide items to people in the short term. But we were just really interested in unpicking this a bit further. And again, we've been working on this for the last couple of years in an unfunded way as well. So it hasn't gone as far as we'd like, because we haven't had the time or the funds. But what we have got on our website, which is whatstheproblem.org, I think, we've got a series of blogs where we've asked people to sort of, to debate this idea around fragmentations of poverty and become part of the conversation. Because even within our team of Ruth, Steve and myself, we have some disagreements and there's some areas we don't agree on. So it's one of those issues that I think definitely needs unpacking a bit more. So I'll let you read that for yourself, but basically we're sort of flagging about how, campaigns to end furniture poverty, make period poverty history, just flagging that actually within that, what we see is, there are sort of these ideas of deservingness creeping in. There are issues around, for instance, people accessing a trust or trust food bank, for instance, have to have a voucher so they can then exchange that voucher for food. So there are levels there of bureaucracy and levels of things that people must sort of hoops they must jump through before they can actually access the goods that they are lacking. And so if you're interested in reading a bit more about this, we've got a working paper on our website. But basically just to sort of flag some of the key issues that we are, raising and questioning and problematizing in the paper. Thinking about, when poverty does become divided into all these different multiple poverties, then what is the problem overall represented to be, and how is this different from actually just focusing on poverty? And so we're questioning, asking, as poverty becomes fragmented, does that then diminish the scope to actually do something about poverty overall? And I think definitely from my point of view, there's the danger as well of further institutionalisation of charitable responses. I think we've seen in the UK, definitely, obviously food banks have become, they're just an unfortunately expected part of our society now. But, there is the risk that can further institutionalize charitable responses rather than actually perhaps providing cash first approaches or giving people actually the money so they can spend it on things that they choose, so they've got that dignity and less of a stigma. Which again sort of leads into the next issue around, thinking about what this fragmentation of poverty and the charitable responses can tell us about deservingness and ideas around moral worth. So we question in the paper, can and should the problem of poverty be thought through and thought about differently? So I would, encourage you all to have a look at that if you're interested. But I just think it sets up what I'm about to talk about in a bit more context, hopefully. And so since the pandemic, we sort of resurrected and reinvigorated our What's the Problem blog a little bit more. As we've seen, like I say, since the pandemic, there's been a sort of mixture of responses to the poverty and increased hardship that we've seen for people on a low income. And so we've seen, again, a sustained focus on the different types of poverty. So obviously we know that food poverty, food banks food bank use has risen, but also the issues around accessing education, which is where the laptop poverty, digital poverty, data poverty have come in. But we've seen how, again, these have been repackaged as different poverty types. And so I think our fear is that, therefore this creates less ambitious policy proposals and perceived solutions. And again, this is really just providing that context to the backdrop with which we're working at the moment. But now I want to take you on a bit of a journey. So this is, from Stockton-on-Tees. So there's me volunteering a few years ago now when I was a volunteer and a researcher at the Trussell Trust Food Bank in Stockton-on-Tees. So you can see that's me at one of the twice yearly neighbourhood food collections that take place in Tesco's. And then just next to me there, you can see this is Hebron Hall, Hebron Church Food Bank, where I volunteered from 2013 until actually I was basically still sort of volunteering up until just before the pandemic. I would go over to catch up with the other volunteers, but I would always end up sort of going over and doing some volunteering and helping out as well. But I've not actually been over since last January, although we do keep in touch on WhatsApp. But yeah, so basically I'll take you on a bit of a story from my research in 2013 in Stockton up until the work I'm doing now, which is with the Global Solidarity Alliance, working with colleagues and activists and people who are running food banks, and people who are, people who've got lived experience of food insecurity, different organisations that I've been working with since 2018. And the pictures on the other side there are just, the top one is from our first and only in-person meeting in Raleigh in North Carolina in September 2019, following the Closing the Hunger Gap conference. And it's a picture of us all at the bottom there after we had our sort of full day strategy meeting. All right, so this is a picture that I took when I first started volunteering and researching at the Trussell Trust Food Bank in Stockton. So I was working on a 5-year project, which was led by Professor Claire Bambra, and it was a big £1 million project looking at what was going on in Stockton-on-Tees in terms of health inequalities. So Stockton was a really interesting place to do this research because it was it had the largest gap in terms of life expectancy in any single local authority in England. So for a man living in the town centre in Stockton, compared to a man just 2 miles away in Hartburn, which was one of the most affluent wards of Stockton, there was a 17-year gap in life expectancy. And for women, that gap was 11.5 years. And both of those, like I say, were the highest in any single local authority in England. What we were interested in that project, which was a large mixed methods project, was, what is driving the rate of health inequalities in Stockton. And so what I was tasked to do was spend 5 years doing ethnographic research in some of the most, but also some of the least deprived parts of Stockton. And so that led to me volunteering not only at the food bank, but also at places such as Citizens Advice Bureau. I volunteered at various different sort of, community growing projects, all sorts of things. Basically, anything that went on in the town centre in Stockton, I would try and get involved with it. So things like credit unions, healthy eating courses. I even ended up going to parent and toddler events, even though I didn't have a toddler to take with me myself. Basically, I would get involved with anything that was going on. And because I had, I spent 4 years in the field in both areas of the town centre and Hartburn, which was the more affluent area, it meant that I had time to build up trust and rapport and really get to know the people that I was working with. So that's when my food bank work came in. So my food bank, everyone thinks that I did my PhD on my postdoc on food banks, but it wasn't. The food bank was actually just my Friday morning. I think it's just because when I was doing the research, food banks really did sort of take off, if you like. When I first started there in 2013, I think it was when the Trussell Trust statistics came out a few months later, that showed that was the first time they'd given out over 1 million parcels. So it really was, I started volunteering at just that point where there was that really big jump. And then since then, we've just seen steady rises. But you can see from this picture, hopefully you can see just how really tiny this cupboard is. So it's basically like you would walk in the cupboard, you could probably fit 2 volunteers in at the same time. There's hardly any space to store food. So when I began volunteering in 2013, that's what the cupboard looked like, and we didn't have a lot more space than that. But you'll see from this picture, so this is a picture taken at the start of 2021, and I don't even think this shows the full scale of it, but basically the entire top floor of the church is now taken up. Each wall's got these huge metal shelves filled from floor to ceiling. It's looking really neat on this picture. It's not normally this neat, but yeah, so we have it basically up each side of the room is absolutely filled with just kilogram after kilogram of food. And we actually have to get somebody to come and check the roof once a year to make sure that that the ceiling's not going to cave in, basically, because because we're really concerned about just the sheer weight of food that is now in the top of that church. So you can see how in those few years, just really how it's grown, and how when just really trying to think about that infrastructure and what's in place, and how actually charitable food is given out. So I just want to give a really quick sort of run through of the work that that basically went into my book Hunger Pains, which came out in 2016, so just over 5 years ago now. So like I say, I did ethnographic research basically for I spent 4 years in the food bank, but my book's actually based on 18 months of my time there. And I was looking at health inequalities overall, but within that I really explored how food bank use was linked to multiple factors, but really at that time it was very much related to issues with the social security system, particularly benefit sanctions, which around that time of doing the research, 2013-14, really were responsible for a lot of the reasons that were driving people towards food bank use. But overall, like I said earlier on, low income, which might sound like I'm stating the obvious, but actually I think that sometimes gets lost when we're discussing why people need to access charitable food in the first place. Obviously, I was interested in the health implications as well, but looking at how food bank provision actually can be unsuitable even in the short term for people with certain pre-existing health conditions, and I've written about that previously as well. And I think, again, and this is something that's been flagged by various people over the years now as well, but people did use the food bank as a last resort. So stigma, shame, embarrassment was something that was very much interlinked with using a food bank, and people would put off and use other resources from family, friends, or whatever they could before they actually turned up at the food bank. And again, this is linked to that issue of deservingness that I was just talking about earlier, and we know how that's linked to the media and public and political discourses. That is like a really, really quick tour of my sort of 5 years of research there, but I just want to sort of help that to situate where that led me to next. So I stopped volunteering. Well, I stopped doing the research in Stockton back in 2017 when I went from Durham University and started working at Birmingham. And it just, at that point, it got me thinking about, well, what we're seeing in the UK is we're just seeing these year-on-year rises in terms of food bank use. We're seeing further institutionalisation. We are seeing further corporate involvement. What can we learn from contexts such as the US and Canada, where they've had a much longer history of charitable food provision than we have? So I applied to the British Academy Rising Star Engagement Award scheme to outline a 2-day workshop, and got the funds, and we held the workshop in November 2018. And so basically this was a 2-day event, focusing specifically as well on early career researchers, and bringing them into conversation with more senior researchers, but also importantly with people who were working in charities, people who were frontline workers, people who were working in the media, people with lived experience, also grassroots activists and organisations from the US, from Canada and the UK. And so what came from that 2-day event was that actually there were some common themes that were coming up across our different contexts. Not least that political factors have obviously led to the need for food banks, food pantries. We've seen the growth of charitable food in the non-profit and third sector. And we had overall an emerging critique of this permanence of the food banking system. And I think some of the people that were at the event, such as Jan Poppendieck, who her book in Sweet Charity in 1998, she warned about all of these things then. I think there was an article I was reading the other day in preparation for this, and in 2012 in The Guardian, and she was saying, once you let the food bank genie out the bottle, you can't get it back in, and that's certainly what's happened here. And again, sort of having a bit of a think and a bit of a collective dialogue around the promise of alternative solutions. So we've seen in the UK for the past few years now, I think the Trussell Trust and their narrative around food banks has changed in some ways. So I think back in the early 2010s, their sort of strapline was that food banks, every town should have one. But then they have gradually moved towards, they have done, campaigning work around universal credit and sort of really emphasising around how income is a problem. But they've also said that, they're pursuing, working towards food bank exit strategies and those sorts of things. Obviously, COVID is, I guess, given additional barriers to actually realising that. But I think certainly across the discussions we had in the 2 days in 2018 was that, we need to be sort of working alongside, but also holding organisations accountable for actually, right, well, what does an exit strategy look like? How can that be achieved? So I just want to go through, I can't actually see the time on my screen, so please, Julie, give me a little message in the chat if I'm talking too much, because I was concerned I would just talk forever. But just want to just briefly go through some sort of key lessons from what we discussed on those few days. And this is from a blog that Alison Cohen, who's the Senior Director of Programs at Why Hunger in New York, which is one of the organisations that we're working with as part of the Alliance work. And one of the things she wrote in her blog, which was about, basically resisting bricks and mortar. So the more infrastructure you build, the more you develop food banks, the more permanent it becomes and you can't get rid of it. And so as well around sort of organising volunteers and people who are actually, living with food insecurity to actually develop a sort of shared analysis of the root cause of the current crisis. As well, thinking about how we can use the right to food to hold the government accountable, and again, talking about that in all of our contexts. And so again, some of the other things that were important there were around sort of building relationships again at local levels, local and regional levels, to really sort of build and advocate for systemic change. As well, issues around sort of dismantling racism in institutions and advocating for real living wages as well. So these are, really fundamental issues that are sort of really a key part of food systems. And again, taking charge of the sort of narratives around hunger and poverty. So all of this work has led to what we've called the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health and Social Justice. So hashtag Rights Not Charities, what we are sort of our social media presence. And this is, we named ourselves, I think it was like last April, so just when the pandemic was starting. And we've been meeting like every month on like virtually for the last 2 and a bit years. Sorry, there was a message came up on chat there and it just distracted me. We've been working together and meeting sort of every month, at least once a month for the last couple of years. Online, but we really saw at the start of the pandemic last year, we just sort of realized that people, especially people who were working on the ground, working in food banks, it really was a crisis. People were, people who'd done work to sort of move their organizations away from away from giving food and moving towards social justice. They were saying they just felt like they'd been sort of transported back to the 80s, where it was just about giving food out. And so people were, at that point, especially, like I say, people on the front line were really concerned about, what can we do about this? How can we sort of mobilize against this? So that's when we sort of, we organized and actually, got ourselves our name then. I don't know why my screen's not moving. Sorry, I think my screen has, wait there. Let me just start that again. It's just stuck. Oh, there we go. Can you see that still? Hopefully.
Sorry, Kayleigh. Yeah, if you just want to share your screen again, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't know where it's gone. Sorry.
It's all right. Don't worry. It's fine.
I don't know where it went.
Mm.
All right.
You've got plenty of time too, so don't.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah, 10:15. Good. Right. Start again.
Brilliant. Thank you.
There we are. That should work. All right, that's better. So, so we got to that point and we were like, at sort of the beginning of the pandemic last year, it really just gave us that additional push to sort of, develop our work around this and see what we could do together. So basically, like I say, we're an international network, practitioners, academics, activists, people with lived experience from those three different contexts: US, Canada, and the UK. But we're also really keen to sort of open that up to other countries, because we know this isn't just a problem in those three countries. We're interested in looking at food insecurity and in so-called wealthy countries. So we're really keen to sort of link up with others, across Europe, for instance, and also other so-called rich countries. And that's something that we're going to be developing as part of the Philip Lever Hume Prize work, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So what we're considering as a group, as an alliance, is thinking about that relationship between the government and the non-profit sector in providing food and other services. So thinking about, how to reframe the relationship between corporations, charities, and the government, really with a goal of how best to achieve and support social justice, and how we communicate a new vision for that to not just policymakers but also the general public, and sort of have it really thinking about how charitable provision is framed. We all know that efforts to encourage people to donate to charitable food are very much framed around encouraging people to do that because it's for the greater good. It's a good thing to be doing, but actually what we're saying is, but what else could we do? Is it then about writing to your MP, or is it about getting involved in other ways as well? So thinking through that, and so developing this sort of shared analysis as a response to rich world hunger and poverty is something that we've like I said been working on for the last couple of years. And again, it's really important to flag here, this isn't new. Much of the analysis has been ongoing. It's got a long-standing history. Other groups have been doing it long before us. But what we really wanted to flag was this sort of rich world hunger, and like I say, the sort of COVID really did sort of push us on to give us a renewed focus in actually doing something around these issues. So you can read our first blog, and then we've also got a Medium account. I'm still not sure actually what Medium is, but I know we've got an account. And for me, a really important part of the Alliance work is actually how we can make sure that we are engaging with people who, who have got lived experience of poverty and of using food banks. And so this picture's taken from, I think this was actually just about 2 weeks before the lockdown last year. I had a workshop with Ben Pearson at Food Power, with some of the people from Food Power Newcastle, and we held a workshop to sort of think through some of the things that we've been outlining as part of the Alliance. We've been working on like a manifesto for change for the last sort of couple of years, and we brought that manifesto to the workshop and said, right, what do we think of this? What's missing? What do we need to include? And that's a really important part of these conversations. And we're always trying to think how best we can facilitate that as part of the Alliance work. So I just want to briefly talk about how this work is going to be extended over the next few years, before finishing off, like I say, encouraging you all to find out more and get involved, hopefully, and then have plenty of time for questions. But basically last year was at the point where, like I say, we really were wanting to push on and do more around the Alliance work. So obviously that needs money. And I wanted to really extend and develop, these ideas that I've been working on for the last few years. So I applied for the Philip Leverhulme Prize, and it was an amazing thing last year to find out that I got it, because I really didn't expect to get it. So that was really, really, really good. But basically the work will begin in November, and it'll be a 3-year program of work that will basically extend and develop the work that we've been doing as part of the Alliance for the last few years. And so what I want to look at as well is, thinking about in the UK, the idea of charitable food as an emergency, needs to be reframed. What we're seeing now, it's not an emergency response. It's something that is becoming, like John Poppendieck said, it is. She's writing in the US there, but if we look at what she's writing there in 1998 and look at where we are now, we can see that in the UK, charitable food is no longer. It's not an emergency. It's something that is really an inherent part of society. So thinking about that in a hopefully post-COVID context, where we've seen the entrenchment and further corporatisation of food aid are becoming ever more critical and prominent, it's really important then that we do sort of, pull that apart a little bit and just look into it in further detail. So the first stage of the Philip Leverhulme work is going to be sort of around really theorising and critiquing the idea of emergency food. So examining the, like I say, the normalisation, corporatisation of emergency food, and also how this links to sort of social security and welfare state developments in all of our different contexts. And we want to explore, what can be learned from building solidarity towards challenging this institutionalisation. I think it's important as well to think about how we can develop a shared analysis of the social, political, economic context across our different contexts. Obviously, there are key similarities, but there are also differences that we need to explore and think through in more detail. And that's going to be part of the first stage of the work. And we know that obviously normalisation and corporatisation of charitable food, like I say, much longer history in the US and Canada. Yet thinking around this in the UK, does remain a bit underdeveloped. But there is growth towards this direction. I know Hannah Lambie-Mumford started a project from Leverhulme as well last year, looking at this corporatisation. And I think, that there are others as well who are interested in that. And I think it's really positive that actually there is a turn towards this. I think it is, again, this is increasingly important, as we've seen from the effects of COVID. So the second stage will, hopefully, well, I've outlined that we'll have a series of in-person information and shared information, shared learning exchanges, which we had actually planned some of those that were supposed to take place last year with some funding we got from Why Hunger, but that obviously unfortunately couldn't take place. So we've been doing all of our work online. But hopefully the second stage will involve really building the Solidarity Alliance network through a series of ethnographic case studies that in the US, Canada, and also the UK. So we're really interested in exploring the questions of, are there examples of income-based alternatives to charitable food? So for instance, in the UK, the Independent Food Aid Network, IFAN, have been working on cash-first approaches that are very much about, as it sounds, making sure that people have the income that they need from local welfare assistance to be able to actually access food and buy it themselves, have that choice, have that dignity, rather than actually giving someone a voucher. So, are there examples of that across the context that we can learn from, that we can share, that we can build on? And thinking as well, what's the relationship between the government and the non-profit sector in providing charitable food? Even just thinking in the past year, we've seen, for instance, the government giving, was it like £30 million to Fair Share? And, we've seen that sort of rise in direct funding, not just in the UK, but elsewhere. And again, I think you've gathered this by now, but really important to me is, how do we make sure that people who are experiencing poverty, people who are, also working on frontline and food banks, how can they share their experiences and advocate for change as well? So some of the priorities for me as well are, thinking about whose voices are missing or not represented as well across the Alliance. How can we ensure that it's a space where people people with lived experience would want to come and be part of, that we're not just talking in all these academic ways that actually don't mean a lot to anybody. How can we make sure we're creating that safe and welcoming space for people to be able to come along and share? And like I flagged earlier, also, what other countries can we engage with? We know this isn't just a problem in the three contexts I've outlined. So how can we sort of extend and develop that work? And who do we need to engage with more broadly to develop and shape our work? So those are some of the sort of priorities that I've got in my mind in thinking about planning the Leave a Hume project that will start in November. And so I just took this from our website actually, because we haven't fully officially launched our website, but it's up there and sort of ready to launch. So I would say please do have a look at that. I've linked to it on the next slide. And there's a lot on there that you can sort of get involved with. But we're really keen as ever. We're not a closed group. We want to open out to whoever would be interested in getting in touch and having these conversations. And basically this is what we have every month. We have these meetings where we come together, to basically discuss stories from the front line and discuss key debates that are happening in all of our contexts. We talk about how we can actually have a collective voice, how we can provide a different narrative to dominant narratives. And I guess ultimately overall, it's about thinking that, there is strength and power in numbers for people in the sort of charitable food assistance world to be able to sort of push for change from within and sort of having a collective voice and coming together as monthly as part of our Alliance work, I think really does and it enable that, and it allows for people to come together and actually share what they think needs to change and really sort of share their own experiences. So yeah, thank you all so very much for listening. I hope that was interesting, and it felt like a really quick whistle stop tour of all the work that I've been doing recently, but hopefully hopefully you all enjoyed that. And do please find out more from our website, which is rightsnotcharity.org. We've also got a Twitter and an Instagram, but yeah, please just give me a shout, get in touch if there is any other questions that you think of after this or you want to find out more. But yeah, thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Kayleigh. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Yes, gosh, I'm sure there'll be lots of comments and questions, because that was really, really interesting. And I thought it was brilliant the way you used your sociological imagination, linking these really important public issues and the private troubles. I think is something you should be really proud of there, I think, and really impactful work I think you've been doing as well, which is just fabulous and really interesting and great to see how it develops over the next 3 years, really. Yeah, so it was just brilliant and so topical as well. And I really loved the well, I don't know if I loved it particularly, but the fragmentations of poverty is really, really important. And yeah, hopefully you'll write some more about that. I did wonder at some point in the next few minutes whether you could share some of the links to work in the chat, rather than I mean, I don't know if people in the audience jotted them down, but often it's useful to put the link to your global alliance and so on, global Solidarity Alliance, and your blogs in the chat there, Rights Not Charity and so on. So the floor is open for questions and comments. You're very welcome to put things in the chat and I'll read them out, or alternatively speak. You have the ability to speak on this platform, which would be, and it'd be really nice to hear from you. So thank you again.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, everyone's saying very nice things. I think there was a question from Gopinder earlier about exit strategies. I think that's something I guess you're going to be exploring in the future. Have you got any ideas, any comments on that?
Yeah, sorry, where was the question? I'm just having a look. Was it on the chat?
Yeah, it was right way back, don't worry. Where are we? Excellent summary of your work, Kayleigh. Would be good to hear more about the exit strategy.
Yeah, thanks, Gopinja. And I think, yeah, it's interesting. So I think we had at the IFAN trustee meeting back in like September, or what year was it? September 2019. I did like a joint presentation with Matthew van Duivenboyd, he was the strategy director at Trussell Trust then, and we were having this, we did this joint presentation around, you know, how we can work towards exit strategies, and we were sort of, yeah, it was a really, I think it was getting to a point where we're having some really good conversations about what that could look like. And I know Trussell Trust were doing work with people with lived experience, people on the front line, to try and look at what exit strategies could look like. So I know there was a lot of work being done around that, but I have to say I'm not sure what's happened to that since COVID, because obviously, like I said in my presentation, I think especially the food bank, people who run food banks who we're working with, they said they've had to go back to just that model of actually just, you know, really providing food at the point of need, so having to sort of put aside some of the more social justice work they were doing. So I'll be, yeah, like Julie says, it's something I'll be definitely picking up in more detail and thinking about, you know, what that would look like. I think looking at what I've seen from my colleagues in the US and Canada and the people we're working with, you know, a lot of alternative models where it is about you know, people coming together to produce their own food, or thinking about you know, how they can have a say in how the food is given out. So having choice, having rights, having dignity. And I think that overall is something that, you know, really I'm going to be exploring a lot more of how we can actually move towards that. And that example I gave before as well, for those who might not have heard of, like IFAN's cash first approach, which they did some work in Scotland, but now they're also doing some work in England and Wales around working with, you know, local authorities to actually provide people with, you know, cash assistance rather than vouchers for food. So I think examples of that, and how I know in the US and Canadian context, they're really interested in learning from especially what's being done, you know, in the UK context. So I think there's definitely that shared learning to be done there.
Brilliant, Kayleigh. I've got questions. Sorry, Gopinja, did you want to respond?
Thanks, Kayleigh. No, that's wonderful. Thank you for the comprehensive response there, Kayleigh. Much appreciated.
No problem.
Thank you. I've got a question from Jake and Isabel, and then one in the chat from Anna. So Jake, if you want to go.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Kayleigh, for your wonderful presentation. I'm also an ethnographer of food banks, but neo-food banks, so activists who have rejected the food bank model and have moved on to something else. But what you were talking about spoke very much to my experiences also. I wondered, where you were talking about sort of the peripheral activity in your ethnographic practice, so you were moving beyond the food bank. So you said you went to like a mother's parenting group and those sorts of peripheral activities. I think what I'm seeing in my own data at the moment is that there is real value in those sorts of activities, but I'm sort of struggling to make sense of how to use them, because I guess what I'm seeing is they're often quite useful for desegmenting food justice from social justice, from health justice. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, sort of how we could use those almost food peripheral people or groups better, because I'm a bit stuck in that one at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess like I suppose it comes back to what I was saying about before around, you know, like my work, it was looking overall about inequalities and poverty. So I think ultimately that's what it is that you'll be talking about in all these different groups, isn't it? So really probably the underlying issues are lack of income, and it is about poverty, and it's about having that lack of, you know, that lack of income that you need to access the food that you need. So I guess thinking about how you can bring it together around that. And then I think Julie was saying in her intro about, you know, we know how food, it's one of those things when I talk about like fragmentations of poverty, we know, like, we talk about food poverty probably more often than any other, and I think there are arguments to say that food is slightly different, and I think we've got some of that on our blogs as well. I would say have a look on the What's the Problem blogs. I think I think Clara Widdowson, she wrote a blog early on at the start of our What's the Problem project last year, saying about why food is different, because it is so embedded with all of these other, you know, it's so embedded with community and how we feel, and family, friends, all those sort of social things and cultural things as well. So I think I'm sorry, I'm probably really rambling and not answering your question. I don't know if it's helpful at all, but
no, it is. I think maybe just a greater call. I'd like to read some of your work, see almost how you sort of made sense of that sort of wider, like you say, the fragmentation. That's the bit that I can't really get through in my analysis at the moment. So that's really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, and get in touch, and I'm happy to like chat more about it. And if you know, once you've had a look through that, if you're interested in writing anything for the blog, we always like really on the lookout for people to do that. So have a look and just give me a shout.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks, Jake. Isabel.
Hello, Kayleigh. Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to ask, you talk about the comparison between the UK, Canada and the US. Coming from Scotland, I wanted to ask about the differences within the UK, because the Scottish government has a very different approach to food poverty. And there's a bill going through to enact, as you probably know, to enact the right to food in Scottish legislation. But I don't know whether how much difference this is actually making on the ground. So my sense is that there is still rising food bank use within Scotland. And I just wondered if you had any comment on that the effect that the government's approach can have on the kind of lived experience.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. I think that's such an interesting question. I think Scotland as well, it is a really interesting example here, and it's one that, like I say, colleagues in the US and Canada are really interested in. So I think thinking back to, like a menu for change with Oxfam and, the work they did around, again, sort of looking towards alternative approaches around providing people with the income that they need rather than providing charitable food. So obviously they've been doing a lot of that work for years, and now it's sort of, like I say, move towards, like IFAN have been doing work, and I'll put some links in the chat as well actually around that, but work that they've been doing in Scotland with the local welfare assistance grants. And obviously, like you say, overall as well, thinking about how the Scottish government are actually looking at enshrining a right to food. And I think there are some really important differences that I think, again, really want to explore those. I know we've got a lot of the people in US and Canada wanting to come over for a learning exchange. We're going to descend on Scotland, so hopefully in person. If not, we'll virtually descend. But yeah, so I think there's definitely a lot of learning to be done there, and I think, especially around thinking about, like you say, about the lived experience. I think it is about that framing and about the deservingness, and I think in Scotland that is a different context to here. There is more of a talk about it's about moving away from stigma, it's about rights, it's about dignity and respect, which I think is something that we are massively lacking, and certainly in the English context. So I think that's a massive difference, and surely that will have, you would imagine it would have at least an impact for people on the ground.
You would hope. I wanted to, so the other thing I should have mentioned was Nourish Scotland, who are a campaigning group, have done quite a lot around dignity provision, and I think that's really important. And I hope it will be impactful. This is not my area of research. I just wanted to chuck the question out.
Yeah, and I think we had a couple of people, maybe last year now, but from Nourish Scotland come along to the Alliance meetings. So we've sort of got a core group of people, but then we have other people who dot in. But again, this is all hopefully going to be part of what I'm doing the first year. I'm going to have an RA working with me, which will be really amazing to like just develop and extend what we're doing. So these are all things on my radar.
Thanks.
Thanks, Isabel.
There's a question from Anna Sophia Salonen. I don't know if you want to scroll on your chat, Kayleigh. I can read it out if you like.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Thank you for a really insightful presentation. In many parts of the world, there is a rising discourse that links charity food assistance with food surplus and waste. Do you see that in the UK? And what would you say to those people who see charitable food provision as a welcome social innovation that responds to both food poverty and food waste?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And I think, again, really interesting question. That's something that is at the heart of the Alliance work that we have been doing. And there's some people in that who are much more familiar, I guess, with the food waste debates than me. But from my perspective, I think, again, food waste should not be used from my perspective, it should not be used for people who are on a low income. It shouldn't be seen as a solution. I think just really anecdotally from my own work in the food bank, I've seen over the years how it's grown in terms of thinking about, we get Marks and Spencer's, Greggs, Morrison's bringing sort of leftover food at the end of the day. It's often past its best. It's often not fit for purpose, and then what happens is at the food bank, us as volunteers then we're like, well, we can't give that out, so then it's up to us to dispose of it, or it sort of passes it on. I think again this shows issues around that, issues of the increase in sort of corporate involvement and just the growth of charitable food overall. I think we can see how there are issues around food surplus, food waste, and I think definitely we have seen in the UK that that is something, especially if we're thinking about issues around how fair share and their model operates and how that's been supported by the government, and the idea that it's somehow better to give surplus food or food waste to people who are accessing charitable provision. So I would certainly that's something that we definitely go against in the Alliance. And if you have a look on our website, I think we've got a podcast series that we just sort of setting off. I think we actually have a podcast around food waste in particular that you might be interested in. It's either on there now or it's definitely coming. So yeah, you might want to have a look at that. What was the other part of your question, Anna? Let me scroll up. Yeah, so I think, I guess I've kind of covered that as well. Basically, very much. I mean, I think Graham Richards has talked about how we shouldn't give leftover food to leftover people, and I know that's something that Fair Share certainly as a charity don't like that terminology, but I think really that's if we bring it back to a basic level, that is often what happens. So I very much go against it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that's a very good answer. Very much against it. Good. Okay. I've got two other questions in the chat. One from Tanya Zerbayan. She says, I wonder what the implementation of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program in the US, sometimes combining it with farmers markets, has done something to change the prominence of food banks there.
Yeah, so again, we're working with, like, in the US, we're working with Jan Poppendiek, she's done a lot of work around this in particular, and looking at the impact on that on SNAP as well, like looking particularly at like low-income families as well, and looking at those different policies that have been brought in. But I think, interesting when you say, Tanya, about farmers markets, and I think from when I went and visited Raleigh in North Carolina a couple of years ago for the Closing the Food Gap, Closing the Hunger Gap conference, we went on some like site visits to places like this where farmers markets who were run by people who were often people who'd experienced food insecurity and those sorts of things, and looking at how that can be an alternative, sort of more community-based model for addressing food insecurity. But in terms of it, of whether SNAP has done something to change the prominence of food banking, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I could say that entirely, but I would say again, and I sound like I'm plugging our website a lot, but do have a look on our website, and there's some, I think we have got a short podcast on there with Jan, who talks about that in a much better way than I can. But really interesting question, Tanya. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. And Nigel has asked, says your work seems to point to the need for universal income to address general poverty rather than fragmented poverties. Is that right? And I think Sally was about to ask the same question, I think.
Yeah, and I see this, I think Angela as well has sort of flagged that as well. Yeah, so again, universal basic income is something that we again have quite a lot of discussions about on the Alliance calls. So looking at how as it says, if people all had that guaranteed and regular income, if we think about how, even in thinking from my own work in the UK context, we know that the inadequacies of the social security system are often, driving people towards food bank use. So it's the fact that people haven't got that, they haven't got an adequate income to start with. And as well, often they're in really precarious, insecure employment. So, I know there are people across the Alliance who've done more work on this than me. Dave Beck in Salford, I think he is perhaps writing a book about universal basic income. Dave, if you're here, I'm sorry if you're not doing that, but I'm sure he said that at one of our calls. So there is an interest across the group in, exploring more about how universal basic income can be, a protector from poverty overall. And I think as well that conversation has gone in tandem with, you know, really trying to realise the right to food, and sort of ratify that, make government sort of actually take that into account. And I think that is a conversation that's been sort of more progressed in the UK and Canada than it has in the US. But yeah, I think that sort of conversation around universal basic income, tying that up to what that means in terms of right to food, and ultimately for me it is tying that into what it means in terms of dignity, respect, and moving away from that charity model towards a rights-based model. And Beth said he is, so I was right. Dave is writing a book on UBI. I thought he was. I wasn't just giving him an extra job that he needed to do.
Yeah, okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. We've got like 1 minute. Has anybody got a last comment or question for Kayleigh while we have her all to ourselves? Oh.
Hello.
Hello, Kelly.
Kelly, I thought I'd ask my question in person. I was typing it out. Brilliant presentation. Thank you, Kayleigh. Just quickly, I wondered if you could say something about your research or similar research feeding into policy, and whether sort of lived experience research is having any impact in terms of the sort of framing, problematization, policies, and so on. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. It's a really good question. And I think certainly, I mean, I could have talked as well about my work on COVID realities, which is a project I've been working on since April 2020, which was like a COVID response grant where we basically outlined a project where we're working in a participatory online way with low-income parents and carers to basically track what's happening to them during the pandemic, but also how is the social security system responding to that. So with that project in particular, we've had like such a massive focus on how can we really share because basically parents and carers have been sharing their experiences with us through diaries, online diaries. We've now got over like 2,000 diary entries since we began the project. So we're really turning now to how we can actually, like you say, influence policy and practice. And so far, actually, it's been easier to do it in a virtual way in some ways. So we've had like a really good response from DWP, for instance. They're really receptive to what we're telling them, and actually really receptive to having a dialogue, which is probably the first time I've experienced that through doing research. So we've had like a series of ongoing meetings with DWP and feeding into like their next communication strategy around universal credit. So saying, right, well, you know, for people who are actually receiving universal credit, what do they think of your communication strategy? What needs to go into it? What shouldn't be in it? What's missing? So that's something that that we've been doing. But yeah, thinking about more broadly, like on this work in particular, again, we've given evidence submissions to calls for evidence. We're working on something at the moment. The UN Special Rapporteur on food, he's just recently released a call. So we're going to submit something as a collective from GSA. So I think again, just sort of when the project really does start kicking in from November, it'll be about how we can maximise those, I think, opportunities with policymakers, but also with journalists and with people who are willing to listen, so that you can actually amplify what you're trying to say. So I would say in some ways this sort of virtual way, it's been, getting a meeting with 20 people from DWP online has been probably easier than trying to get them all in one room and trekking everybody to London. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I think there's opportunities there. It's just, I think being persistent and polite.
Really interesting. Thank you for answering.
No problem. Thanks, Kelly.
That's brilliant, Kayleigh. And everyone, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you, Kayleigh, for a fantastic opening plenary. We're all really delighted.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.